Welcome to the Endurance Drive podcast.
Our mission is to share the key principles that structure our approach to endurance training and coaching.
I'm Jim.
And I'm Katie.
And today, Katie, huge milestone. What episode is this?
This is episode 20.
Yeah.
And it's exciting because I remember you told me early on in the podcasting game, it's like some teeny fraction of podcasts make it all the way to, was it episode 3?
Right, yes.
And then a much teenier fraction make it all the way to episode 20. And so here we are. It's awesome.
Here we are. Congratulations. Well, it's funny too, because we said 3. And so, of course, being us, that what we did is we recorded 3 right in a row, right? We did them all at the same time. It's like, okay, we're going to get past 3 because we're going to record 3, we're going to publish 3, and that gets us the first milestone.
Exactly. Yeah. So that one was an easy one, but this one was harder. And we did kind of like circumvent it by now releasing 2 every week, but that still reflects a lot of hard work. So congrats to us. I'm super happy to be here.
That's thanks to you and Elena too as well, putting in all that great female athlete stories. But it is funny when you came on and I said, why does this always feel like race day?
Yeah. It is like, I mean, we've talked about this before, but it can be a little bit scary to put yourself out there in a podcast setting. But I have to say that the reactions that we've gotten from our whole community to this podcast is what keeps us going. It's been so fun and we feel so supported. So just, I guess this is a moment to say thank you to all of our listeners near and far. It seems like our listener base is growing and it's expanded beyond people that we just kind of know. So that's really cool. If we don't know you and you're listening, thank you so much. And we're excited to keep putting out the content.
Yeah, I'm just so thankful. You could say it's touched so many people. I think we started that we thought, if this can help like one person, this is great. And then we said, well, if it can help further educate our athletes, that's great too. And then suddenly people we don't know, like you say, don't know, start saying, hey, I listened to your podcast. And again, we just appreciate everybody. Everybody's attention is really valuable. And we just appreciate that you listen and we're all learning together and we're getting great feedback. So thank you.
Awesome. Well, I think with that, we will move into our favorite segment. And we've heard actually that this is a favorite segment of a lot of our listeners. So let's do our coaching and training insights. I guess I'll take the first one. So my coaching and training insight, I actually have a couple this week, but the first one is I would like to take us above and beyond the framework of a rest day. And I'm going to coin a new term. Maybe this already exists, but I'm going to call it reset days. And I think what's interesting is we usually program rest days for our athletes on Mondays where they don't have any structured training. Maybe they'll take a walk, maybe they'll do some mobility work, but in general, it's a day off. But I think sometimes we find that because there's this day off from training, athletes will pack in a whole bunch of like extra work or errands or other things that are life stressors into their rest day. And so then even if their body's getting a break, their mind might not necessarily be getting a break. And we've had a trend where people will show up on Tuesday. Often they'll then have maybe a tougher workout on Tuesday since they've recovered for a day. And they're pretty exhausted when that day starts. And I think it's because maybe we aren't exactly giving our rest days the amount of rest that they actually need. And so sometimes when that happens, if you feel like you're in a rut with training or with life, I think it's helpful to have a reset day. So reset day is something that I'm going to say is focused on sort of total health. You might think of it as a mental health day meeting a rest day from training. So it's good to like take that time off from training, but we also want you to think about whether it's possible to really just clear your calendar. So think about sleeping in, thinking about avoiding working. You're going to avoid traditional training like swim, bike, run, or strength. You could kind of incorporate some alternative Z1 movement. So thinking about a hike or a paddle or an easy ski, yoga, something like that. But most importantly, we want you to make time for things that really fill up your cup. So time with loved ones, good food, watching a movie, early bedtime. And again, you don't necessarily need a reset day every week. And some people are really good about protecting their rest day and making it a low stress day. But if you really feel like you're hitting a rut, having those reset days, in my experience, can be totally game changing.
Yeah, I love that. I love the reset day, and I'm gonna steal it one again from you. But I love it from really 2 perspectives. One's from a physiological perspective, and the other is from a psychological standpoint. And so from the physiological side, this recovery and reset days, they're important to lower these cortisol levels, which if they are continually high, lessen gains from strength training. So no new muscle growth. They could increase bone fractures, sleep is difficult, and your overall energy levels just drop. So these recovery and reset days help invoke your parasympathetic nervous systems, allowing you just to relax, sleep better, and lower cortisol. And from a psychological standpoint, the reset and recovery days are important, particularly if you tend to be a performance performance-based identity athlete. And this is an athlete who tends to think of their worth or identity as linked to how fast they may swim, bike, or run in workouts or in races. I know that rings a bell for me and probably rings a bell for other people. So, reset days, like you mentioned, Katie, is that will give you the space to focus on other parts of your life that are truly meaningful and important.
Yeah, I agree with all that. And I think it's sometimes tough because you don't get rewarded in the same way for a reset day that you might for like a really hard swim or a bike. You're not necessarily putting it on Strava. Although, hey, there is a posting feature on Strava, and maybe we should normalize just posting our low stress reset days. But I think zooming out and thinking about your long-term health and what you're really trying to get out of training and performance, it's not about Strava and it's not about metrics. And we know that stress plus rest equals growth. So just think of this as really, really optimizing for that other side of the equation, because we think that, again, the reset day is not about taking a step backwards. It's setting yourself up for many leaps forwards going into your next day of training.
Yeah, I think we should start the reset brags kind of hashtag.
I love it. Okay, next insight from me. Athletes who are working busy full-time jobs, I've heard this from a couple different people recently. I think it's really, really important to think about structuring your day and making time for a really big lunch. So I've had a couple athletes who have come to me and they usually do their training maybe at 5:30 or 6 p.m. And they've just been feeling kind of low energy in those sessions. And I was asking like, okay, well, what are you eating throughout the day? Maybe they're kind of grabbing a protein bar right before they jump into that workout. A lot of it, I think, is stemming back to not having a super good lunch. So it's always good to be thinking about calories being critical, but the timing is also going to be critical. And if you're doing your workouts in the evening, that lunch is so, so important. You don't want to be saving things up for, post-workout dinner. You're just going to feel terrible there. So timing of nutrition and frequent snacking as well is just really important.
Yeah, this one really hit for me. I think it was last Monday. I had a really big Nordic ski. And as we talked about, Nordic skiing is very tempo, thresholdy type stuff. And so you're just burning a lot of glycogen, a lot of calories. And admittedly, I probably didn't feel all that well during the ski. And then after in the afternoon and the evening was sort of the standard fare. But things were a little bit moved around because I was coaching at night. And then the next day I got up on Tuesday, had my regular breakfast, and then rolled into a swim before lunch, did not have lunch. And about a third of the way into the main set, I realized I am crashing. I was dizzy. And I realized, I didn't focus on the calories, didn't focus on the timing. So like you say, snacks for the win.
Yeah. And again, sometimes it's easiest to learn this lesson by really screwing it up. We've done this before, but if you can avoid that, I'd say it's a lot less painful to just like take our advice and eat a great lunch and lots of snacks.
Yes.
Last one here. This is on the other side of the fueling game. I have a lot of athletes who have been absolutely crushing the fueling game. So something I've done a little bit differently this year is, in addition to dropping workouts into TrainingPeaks, I have also dropped in a suggested fueling strategy. And this is not like you must do exactly this, but it's just some guidelines on the amount of carbs you should be taking in per hour and the intervals that you should take them in. So an example is if people are just starting out, I'll say, okay, if you have a bike that's maybe 2 hours long, let's try for getting 70 to 80 grams of carbs in per hour. And you want to be snacking on, say, 20-minute intervals, or sometimes we'll do 15, sometimes we'll do 30, kind of depending on the method that people are taking those carbs in. And 70 to 80 is that floor. In the past, I've tried 40 to 60 grams per hour, but I think we can think about 70 to 80 as more of a floor now. And if you get really good at that, you can get well into the hundreds, which is, as we've learned from a lot of the really high performing triathletes, as well as Coach Lena, who is taking in, 140 to 150 grams of carbs per hour. That can be awesome. So I just wanted to read a couple quotes that I got from athletes in the last couple weeks in their TrainingPeaks. Someone said, I've never fueled that frequently before. I did it by the 20-minute mark interval, getting in around minute 25, 45, 105, 125. This was during a trail run. And I didn't feel sick or fatigued by the end like I sometimes do. And then another one that just made me laugh out loud was someone said, dude, fueling like that hits different, all caps. Like I was going 30 seconds faster than my usual Z2 pace on the run without thinking about it. And this was a brick run off the bike. So these are just a few of many amazing comments I've gotten about how fueling is working. So please feel free to send those in to us because they make us really happy. And I think they just spread the word that you might be skeptical about, like, should I really be taking in 80 to 100 grams of carbs per hour? But it will revolutionize your tri game or your endurance game in general. And I think there's a lot of untapped potential there.
Yeah, nice job. Again, I'm gonna steal that. Start to do nutrition suggesting in my TrainingPeaks. And one thing I've also started to see, at least in TrainingPeaks for my athletes, is we're getting these longer workouts now. People are starting to get outside, or even just some of the Zwift things are getting to be an hour and a half, 2 hours. Some longer runs. Volume is increasing. So I think this is a really timely point. So thanks for bringing that up.
Of course. All right, on to your insights, Jim.
Okay, I think I have 3 insights this week.
Perfect. You learned a lot.
I learned something anyway. Okay, so my first one is that long distance training requires athlete independence and equal parts interdependence on your support crew, and your support crew being your family, friends, and maybe work colleagues. So as the races and events get longer, each one of those qualities must expand equally and proportionally. So in other words, you need to become super independent, but you also need to become very interdependent on your support crew.
Yeah, I think we said last time around this, So You Want to Be an Ironman episode, that like at the end of the day, your relationship should be stronger when you finish one of these big races. So think about the right balance of supporting your crew, having them support you, and also being independent.
Exactly. And I think also sort of a related interesting phenomena that we may have talked about before, but in the beginning of a race, usually a long race, you're often this, hard driving, independent, egocentric athlete. And as the race day unfolds, you move more toward being an interdependent human being. And so as if physically and mentally you wear down, yourself and your ego barriers lower, and you begin to open up to receiving help and community support. So this is where race volunteers and family and friends on course help get you to the finish line. And it's really that sense of like moving from the me to the we.
Is that a new catchphrase for us? Should we make t-shirts?
I think I stole that from somebody else, but I really like that.
I love it. That's a great one. Yeah, I think we know that it's going to be that crew that gets you across the finish line. So don't be afraid to lean on them.
My second one, and this came from my athlete, Charlie. He's one of my Ironman athletes, and he commented because he's done a lot of marathon training before, but he said, hey, this type of training just feels like a different type of fitness from when I was marathon training. He said, I now just feel more robust and durable and balanced. And he said, I may not be running as fast, but I just overall feel better. And anyway, I just thought that was a great insight and got me thinking about that there are so many different types of fitness out there, and that each type makes you feel a little bit different than the other. So it's kind of hard to compare like marathon fitness versus Ironman fitness versus, I don't know, even like swim fitness or bike fitness. So it's all kind of a little bit different.
Yeah, I think that's something that we can also just think about, there being a time and a place for different types of fitness wherever you're at in your life. Like maybe right now you have time to train for an Ironman, but in 5 or 10 years, maybe you're a new parent and you might have time to train for a fast 5K or something like that, or you're just trying to get out once a day for some movement. So I think we can think about, optimizing for the type of fitness that you can sustain in the context of your life. That's not always going to be Ironman, but I totally agree that Ironman build is sort of this durability training that just gets you pretty balanced across all the domains.
Yeah. So shout out to Charlie on that one. And then my third one is that I tend to primarily focus on the physical side of training, but I've recently started to deep dive on a mental side of performance, such as flow, in the zone, being present, etc. So if you ask any athlete, they want to reach peak performance in training, and especially on race day. So, many of my challenges my athletes face are less physical and more mental. And as coaches, we always say it's fairly easy to get someone fit, but we know how to do this, but it's not always easy to get through the rigorous training process and show up mentally race ready. So for me, I want to upgrade my mental skills toolbox and to help athletes unlock and remove the mental barriers. And on that, I was listening to the Norwegian Method podcast, and it's interesting to note how many times Coach Olav Alessandro Boo, who's the coach of Kristen Blumenfeld and Gustav Eden. And if you guys don't know that, they're the best triathletes in the world. But Boo mentioned multiple times, said being mindful and present as a key to executing workouts, and that this is an investment in your present and future performance. So in sum, treating the body and mind as one unit will become a big focus for me in 2024, and I'm super excited.
I love that. Yeah. I mean, I think we know that we will do a full episode on life stress, but whenever your life stress is high and being distracted with other things, you cannot be fully present in your workouts. And that's going to require some workout modifications, because it's just going to be a mess if you try to put those things together. And I like that constant reminder for sure.
Okay, so that ends our coaching and training insights. And now we get to dive into today's topic, which is everyone's favorite subject, which is data. And specifically, we will opine on what is good and useful data and what is bad or extraneous data.
Yes. And we have actually brought this up a lot. Data is always intersecting with what we do. We coach on a platform called TrainingPeaks that basically gives us all of our athletes' data all the time. And all of our athletes also usually are using Garmin, or they have a Whoop, or they have an Oura Ring, or many of the above, Apple Health, whatever it is. So we have a lot of data at our disposal. And I think sometimes there's too much and it can be really overwhelming. And sometimes there's data that can really, really help us think about how to best support our athletes. So when we're trying to strike this balance between having data help you out or drive you crazy, we want to break down what we think we should actually be paying attention to. So I think we're going to play a game in honor of episode 20. The game is called Good Data or Bad Data. And we're going to throw a bunch of different pieces of data out there, and we will tell you what we think about whether they are good or bad data. You ready to get started?
Can I start? Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. So this is probably an easy one that everybody can answer, but is heart rate good data or bad data?
Ooh. Well, it's actually interesting because your heart does a lot of things that give us data. So we could first just think about heart rate data that you get from, for example, a chest strap, or there are other ways to measure it. We know that the wrist optical sensors are pretty bad, but let's say you're using a chest strap and you have accurate heart rate data coming in. I think heart rate data is really good data. So we've talked about zone 2, we've talked about your lactate threshold, we might want to know your max heart rate. All of that stuff is really useful because if we go back to this conversation about, staying below your lactate threshold, staying in that fat burning zone, that is the key to unlocking endurance performance. And if you're not using heart rate, then you might have trouble figuring out where that is. Sure, we could say to new nose breathing, we could say conversational pace, but at the end of the day, having a number that tells you if you're in the correct zone or not to optimize that mitochondria factory and optimize fat burning for endurance performance, I think that's really valuable. How about you, Jim?
Yeah, no, I totally agree. And actually something I learned this week that's sort of related to this was that the stroke volume, which is the amount of blood that your left ventricle pumps out, it really maxes out at about 60% of your max heart rate. So if you think about 60% of your max heart rate, it's actually a pretty low number. So anyway, just sort of bringing us back to like heart rate it's good data, it's interesting data, and oftentimes it doesn't have to be very high data as well.
Mm-hmm, exactly. So we would say, this has happened a couple of times before where I've had athletes have their power meter go out or something and they only have heart rate. If I could only pick one piece of data, I think I actually would pick heart rate over pace, over power, over anything else, because for Ironman or other ultra type events, that's going to be the most valuable thing we can look at. Another one we could talk about with heart rate is resting heart rate. So a lot of people wear some type of fitness tracker that can tell us where your resting heart rate is overnight. And I think resting heart rate can be a valuable piece of data too, because it can tell you how much stress your body is under, usually at night or in general. And I don't pay a ton of attention to someone's heart rate relative to someone else resting heart rate. Is your resting heart rate 50 and your resting heart rate is 60 and yours is 45, whatever that is. But I think if you're paying attention to changes in your resting heart rate, that's a really good indicator that something might be stressing your body out. And what's tough is you don't always know what it is. Like, are you getting sick, or do you have life stress, or did you train too much, or whatever it is? But I think looking at those trends, if I wake up and see that my resting heart rate has spiked a lot, maybe 10 up from where it usually is, I'm going to say, that's interesting. Maybe I will just be a little bit gentler on my workout today. I'm not going to shut it down entirely unless I otherwise feel bad, but it's useful to at least have that frame of mind for going into workouts.
And related to that, are you doing any HRV as well?
Yeah, so HRV is another one we could throw into that. And in my experience, HRV trends with resting heart rate. So if your HRV, you want that to be higher, relative to your baseline, and then you want resting heart rate to be lower. Although sometimes I think HRV has been a little bit less reliable for me than resting heart rate has. And I think actually on our interview with Greg Mueller, he talked about not really being able to understand how HRV intersects with all these things. I think we know that a big plummet is probably not a good thing. But again, you always want to be thinking about this readiness data really holistically. So even if your resting heart rate is up and your HRV is down, but you feel amazing, I wouldn't say to not do your workout. Do your workout. And maybe it's just that the optical sensor wasn't doing a great job that day.
Yeah. And so just to clarify there, so HRV is heart rate variability. And yeah, I started down the HRV path for a while and would wake up in the morning and put my heart rate strap on and do it. And I think partly I was just lazy, I gave up on it, but partly I couldn't quite tell how to action that data. But I do look at my resting heart rate, and I think that does say a lot. So I think, in this case, HRV is important. And there are coaches that I really respect that use HRV as part of their training plan is a real foundation. But I think to really simplify things here, I think resting heart rate's a great indicator.
Definitely. So then 2 questions still on heart rate. We've maybe answered them a little bit before, but I'm going to ask them again. Jim, do you think heart rate data is useful, number 1, during strength workouts, and number 2, during swimming workouts?
Right. So during strength, I do have some athletes who do wear their chest strap during their strength workouts, and that's fine. But I do think that, strength, it's really typically not an aerobic sport. You're lifting weights. And as we said before, we're advocating for lifting pretty heavy. So you're probably lifting, 6 to 10 reps over, I don't know, maybe 15, 20 seconds or something. So it's more of an aerobic sport. And then you should be taking like a 2 or 3 minute rest between those sets. So I think that your heart rate really doesn't express or quantify the load of strength training.
Yeah, I would agree with that. And I think as endurance athletes, we're used to kind of wanting our heart rate to stay up during workouts. So this was a mistake that I made early on in strength training, was like, okay, well, I should probably just do a lot of reps and take very little rest, but not very heavy reps, because I guess my average heart rate should be closer to something that's like a zone 2. But at the end of the day, you're creating more of an aerobic workout than actually building any strength. So it's totally good if you sit down in between your sets and your heart rate goes down to 60. Like, that's awesome. That's totally fine. And, it's tricky because TrainingPeaks sometimes punishes you a little bit, where if you upload a workout and it tries to calculate your training stress score, which we'll explain later based on heart rate, that's going to be higher if your heart rate's higher, but you can do a really, really heavy set that's doing a much bigger strain on your body. So at the end of the day, we'll get back to TSS, but loop in your coach about how we should quantify strength workouts, because I don't think heart rate best captures how challenging a strength workout was or how good the strength stimulus was.
Yeah, correct. I agree. Okay, so swimming. So should I be the swimmer, the triathlete in the pool with my chest strap on?
We have talked a lot of smack about triathletes in the pool with their chest strap on. So my assessment here would be it's just not that useful for swimming, because again, the rest is a little bit different. It can be a little bit less of a sustained aerobic activity depending on the type of set that you're doing. Sometimes it is a sustained aerobic activity. But I think with swimming, which we'll come back to, there's just a lot of other data that we're paying attention to. And your heart rate while swimming doesn't necessarily map onto your heart rate running or biking, just because you're horizontal and your max heart rate might be different, your threshold rate might be different. And we're not going to, do a lactate test in the pool with a little finger prick or anything while you're swimming to figure out exactly where that is. So I would say avoid the extra drag or the chafe of a heart rate strap in the pool and don't worry too much about it. And if you're worried about the intensity, we can talk about other swimming metrics that are useful. But most of our athletes are working so much on technique that it's just not going to be a huge focus for us.
Yeah, 100% agree. So you mentioned TrainingPeaks, and boy, if you are a TrainingPeaks user, you see a lot of metrics in there. And we want to just do a quick overview of some of those metrics. So I think the primary one we see in TrainingPeaks is what's called TSS, and it's all about training stress score. Do you want to define that for us a little further, Katie?
Yeah, it took me a couple of years to even understand what TSS was, but I think now I can speak with some authority on TSS. So it's basically a way to quantify how hard a given workout was. And the crucial thing about TSS is that it's not really absolute. It's all relative to your personal threshold zone. So what is your threshold swim pace? What is your threshold run heart rate, your threshold run pace, your threshold bike power? And again, threshold is the intensity that you could sustain if you're going all out for an hour. So for example, when we do an FTP test on the bike, functional threshold power test, we're trying to figure out what that number is for you. So TrainingPeaks, we put in all of your zones based on testing. And if you're a new athlete with us, you'll notice that often we will have you do a run threshold test or a bike threshold test, swim test early on, because otherwise these metrics are not going to be accurate. And once we have that, TrainingPeaks will say, okay, you went for a 4-mile run and it was at this pace, and we're going to calculate TSS based on how hard that was relative to your zone. So to give you an example, I believe 100 TSS would be running for 1 hour at your threshold pace. And it's very rare that you're actually going to go out and run for an hour at threshold pace. Maybe if you're racing a 10K, that could be about 100 TSS. But TSS is going to respond to things like both intensity and volume. So you could get 100 TSS maybe doing a zone 2 run if it were about 10 miles. We find that usually there's about 10 TSS per mile in zone 2 running. You'll see all of our bike workouts have TSS attached to them, again, based on that intensity. And similarly, we have swim TSS as well. And the reason that TSS is important is because as coaches, we go into TrainingPeaks and we're usually targeting a total number of TSS per week, and we're going to build that over time. So I think that's the biggest number that we are building. Of course, we're getting more hours, we might be getting more intensity, but at the end of the day, we want a consistent ramp up of more and more TSS. And this is going to be super different for runners versus triathletes. Triathletes usually can sustain a lot more volume because it's 4 different sports, swim, bike, run, strength. Whereas runners, we're not going to try to get you 1,000 TSS unless you're running like over 100 miles a week. And we certainly don't have any of those athletes. So it is going to be a little bit different, but I think it's useful to say, okay, how much TSS am I getting per workout, per week, and how is that building over time?
And then all that TSS rolls up into something you'll see in TrainingPeaks on the right hand side, which is what's called CTL, ATL, and TSB. And we're just going to do a quick little review of what they are. So first one here is chronic training load. I think that's one that we use quite a bit and we start to pay attention to.
Yeah, so CTL fitness, it's a fitness metric that responds to just the cumulative amount of TSS that you are doing in the given week. And that's usually going to be a large number that's hopefully going to be larger than your ATL, your fatigue number. And then finally, your form number is going to be the difference between fitness and fatigue. So the reason all these numbers are important is because when your form gets really, really, really low, that means that your fatigue is a lot higher than your current fitness level. And if, you flip the equation and fitness is higher than fatigue, that means you're in really good form to be racing, for example. So actually, I think I may have said that incorrectly before and that you want fatigue to be lower than fitness. Often we find that it's a lot higher, actually. And it's okay to be in some state of kind of chronic fatigue as you are going through your training plan. It's not chronic fatigue in the medical diagnosis sense, but it's just like you always are dealing with some level of load. And then the purpose of a taper is to reverse those trends and get to the point where your fitness is above that fatigue level and you can really display all of your fitness. But I think that sweet spot is figuring out the amount of fatigue that we can sustain while still building fitness and not being counterproductive. And that is really a fine balance that, numbers can help us with a little bit.
Right. And TrainingPeaks does all this exponential weighted 42 days, blah, 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 blah. But the point is that you talked about is this TSB, this form number. And typically what we find is that most adaptation in athletes happen between -10 and -30 TSB. And again, this makes sense if you're actually a TrainingPeaks user, and apologize if you're not. But that's where basically we're putting in the work. And then if an athlete starts to say, hey, I'm kind of tired, I'm starting to feel it. Often I'll look to the TSB and I'll say, oh gosh, yeah, the last couple of weeks they've been, say, at, -20 TSB, -30 TSB. And it's a validation of saying, oh yeah, you should be tired because you have been putting in the work, a big load. And then it's just really a key indicator for both the athlete comment and the numbers say, okay, it's time for a recovery week. And then as you say, we try to reverse that number on the taper so that we end up, say, at an Ironman that number is plus 25 or 30. So you're very, 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 very fresh.
Exactly. And I would say if you jump in your TrainingPeaks right now, let's say you're a new athlete, you might see some crazy numbers. You might see like a -50 TSB or something. Part of that is because TrainingPeaks needs a little bit of time to learn you. It often assumes that you walk in with like 0 fitness level when, if you've been moving around or doing any level of training, that's probably not the case. So I would say in general, you probably need maybe 2 to 3 months for TrainingPeaks to even kind of normalize and understand where you're at. There are kind of ways that we can set that up differently, but I wouldn't worry about it too much right now because, again, we are also holistically looking at this. And a point we're going to return to is, yeah, this data is useful, but it certainly isn't everything. It's not thinking about your life stress. It's not thinking about your mental health. It's not thinking about your work commitments and your family commitments. And all of that stuff does intersect with how you're going to feel. So in general, this is a primer on the zone data that we can use, but it's definitely not going to be the only data.
Right. So some people do have TrainingPeaks, other people don't, but almost everybody we know has some smartwatch on their wrist. And for a lot of us, that's Garmin, for better, for worse. So your Garmin's constantly telling you things. And we like to go through and sort of play a little game of, is this important? Is this not important? Right. So we call this segment Stuff That Garmin Says. Mm-hmm. So the first one that Garmin says, Garmin Performance Condition. Katie, what is that? Or do we pay attention to that?
We do not pay attention to that. So every day Garmin has a performance condition for you. Is that the one that's like unproductive, productive, prime, whatever it is?
Yeah, it's a lot of smack talk.
It's a lot of smack talk. Yeah. And we would say we are using data in TrainingPeaks as well as just you telling us how you are feeling as athletes to think about your performance condition. We might look at things like resting heart rate or sleep a little bit. But I find that Garmin does not take enough data into account, and it's relying so much on that usually optical wrist sensor, which is not very accurate. So I would say if you want to, you can turn performance condition off. Often I find that it messes with athletes mentally more than giving them any useful information.
And related to that as well, Garmin has this training status and this training readiness. I think you just mentioned that as well. That's obviously a big no as well.
Garmin also has an amount of recovery time in hours. So I'm sure we've all been there where it's like 3 days. And like, I think that's the highest amount that you can get. But I will tell you that a couple times I've had a 3 days recovery and I feel good within a day. And other times it's been 3 days after an Ironman and I need 3 weeks to recover. So I would not pay a ton of time to those hours because Garmin has no idea what you're doing in the recovery time. And, we talked about on the episode with Kevin that the best way to recover is to sleep a lot and eat good food. Garmin has really no idea. Maybe it can sort of look at sleep, but it doesn't change recovery hours based on that. It has no idea what you're eating. And so I would say just throw that one out too. It is not going to be very useful.
And another one too that we get from that flashes up a lot, usually at the end of rides. Garmin says you are heat or altitude acclimated. And I really don't know how they figure out the heat acclimatization. I know it does pop up when it starts to get a little bit warmer, but I've never been able to make, if they say you're 28% heat acclimated, but then you don't bike for a week or something, and it says you're 32 or 16, it doesn't seem to make any sense. And also their altitude acclimation is interesting because, we mostly train at 800 feet to 1,000 feet, and often my Garmin tells me that I'm acclimated to 2,500 feet and above. And so I'm not sure where that number is coming from. And honestly, just overall in general, like anything that's below sort of 3,500 feet, you're just not going to feel any kind of performance. There's no real acclimating in training and racing at 5,000 feet and above. Sure, there's some significance there and some adaptation that needs to happen. But anything under that, you really don't need to pay attention to that.
Yeah. And I think if your racing is hot, we can work with you on a sauna protocol. We have lots of other tactics, but I would not let Garmin dictate how you're going to perform in the heat at all. Next one, Garmin tells us our lactate threshold and our VO2 max. What do we think about that?
Yeah, so I saw the Garmin lactate threshold. I don't know if I've seen it come up on mine. Maybe it's turned off. But there are common algorithms that determine threshold levels. So they may be using something common. So I actually don't have an informed comment on that. But I do on the VO2 max. It is interesting. I do actually think that is somewhat accurate. And I would be interested to hear from other people who are listening to this podcast to say, if you've tested in a lab and your VO2 max number, is your Garmin flashing you a similar number? I'd be very curious. Hey, have you had that experience at all?
Well, actually, I have to say this is something that I'm going to give Garmin a little bit of credit because we did lactate threshold testing in a lab January of 2023, I guess, when we were getting ready to train for Placid. And I was shocked, but my lactate threshold and my VO2 max were basically within 1 point of what Garmin had told me that they were. So that was validating in the sense that, okay, maybe this is actually somewhat accurate and maybe we don't feel bad recommending to our athletes to use that. But I've also seen data that really doesn't make too much sense to me. And I think the crucial thing is that your Garmin needs to really get to know you to be able to determine that. So if you just got a Garmin 3 weeks ago and you've only been doing zone 2 workouts, I'll often have, TrainingPeaks telling me my athlete has a new lactate threshold and it's 112 beats per minute. And you're like, no, this is not really going on here. And that might be feeding from Garmin. So I would say, again, you need to have your watch for a while for us to believe that this is accurate. And you've got to do some racing with it. You've got to do some testing with it and a lot of zone 2 with it as well so that your Garmin can kind of figure out how to discern the differences.
And sort of the last one that I love the most about Garmin is the Garmin weather warnings. And so this pops up a lot on my Garmin 520 bike computer. And first of all, I wonder, does Garmin think that my bike computer is the only source of weather that I have? So I find that very, very interesting. That there's a storm coming.
Maybe they heard about the Jim Anderson heat index and they were like, we have to correct this man.
We must stop him now. Exactly right. He's on his bike. We must stop him now. Which leads into my other one, which says, often the warning is 18 hours, 24 hours in advance. And, I do some long bike rides, but I don't do 22-hour bike rides. So part of me is I sort of got to take a compliment that Garmin wants to give me a 24-hour advance notice of a winter storm or windstorm coming so I can wrap up my 22-hour ride and get home safely.
Wow. You have a newer Garmin Edge than I do. I have a pretty old one, and it just tells me all of these weather things I haven't really heard too much about. I get gale warning a lot. I never really use the term gale. I've never really experienced a gale. I think it's wind in the waves or something, but yeah, I'm always concerned about that gale warning. And it tells me every single time I cross a new town border. So if you live in the Northeast where there's a town every 2 miles and you get a new gale warning every 5 minutes when you're on your bike, that one's super fun to deal with for sure. So I think to sum this up, we would say that Garmin's artificial intelligence is a little less intelligent and a little more artificial. In general, use it for pace and use it for heart rate, but we have a lot of other ways to figure out the relevant data that we care about.
Right. And we do appreciate our Garmin watch. You wouldn't mean to pick on Garmin because I know other ones do this as well. And they are super useful to have. But yeah, some of the stuff they say is a little bit goofy. And I know that you and I both have to answer a lot of questions from athletes who say, my Garmin is saying this. And if we had a nickel for every time we had to say, please ignore your Garmin,
then we would be very, very rich. And coaching would be very lucrative.
We wouldn't need sponsorships of the podcast if that happened.
Yeah. Never mind, Nature's Bakery. We're fine.
Right. Exactly.
All right, we're going to move through a quick rapid fire of a few more areas where we have a lot of metrics. So let's talk quickly now about run-specific metrics. So when you're running, we could be looking at heart rate, pace, cadence. There's this thing called run power, stride length, ground contact time. I'm going to say that out of all of these, the biggest things that I care about are heart rate, which we already talked about. So think about the intention of the workout and ground with that. Pace is useful, especially for our runners, because we will figure out, what's a goal marathon pace, half marathon pace. We will often look at paces for Ironman, although my first instructions are to kind of use heart rate because you never know where things are going to go if it's really, really hot. And cadence is good because we don't want a really low cadence. So somewhere usually, I think between 170 and 180 is a great place to try to train your cadence. You don't want to be at like a 140 run cadence or anything. And if you have those three, I think you're in pretty good shape. Jim, what do you think about the other ones? Power, stride length, ground contact time, all that good stuff.
Yeah, good question. So run power, I know that's something that has come up quite a bit, and it seems triathletes are always the first people to buy whatever new devices out there. And I actually bought one of the first stride power meters, run power meters, and it was interesting. And I was really impressed with how it responded to the increased watts going up a hill. But a couple of things I realized that I wasn't gaining any insight over, say, heart rate and pace and maybe even cadence. So I feel like running is one of those things that if you have heart rate and pace, you're doing well.
Yeah, and we can see elevation too on these runs, so we know if it was hilly. And maybe the one other thing that run power could give us is like, is it windy? But if it's windy, you could just tell us as your athlete, and we'll be like, okay, yeah, that checks out. Why your miles were a little bit faster at the tailwind and a little slower with the headwind.
Right. You live in New York City. It's windy, right? We know that. But a couple other things here you mentioned here is, the stride length and ground contact time. And there's a little bit of value there. But, stride length is really a function of your run strength and mobility, which we address, via run drills and hill repeats and gym work, mobility work. So our advice is do not try to consciously increase your stride while running. I did that once and ended up with a really nice hamstring injury. It put me out for a few months. It's related also with ground contact time. Again, it could be useful to remind yourself to pick up your cadence. But like stride length, don't focus on it per se while running. And I looked at Garmin today, Garmin Connect, and they had this great graphs for stride length, ground contact time, run cadence, and vertical oscillation. But, those things vary greatly depending on the run terrain. So I went on a hilly run recently, and those numbers are just sort of all over the place. So I don't use them. We don't use them that often. Maybe they'd be useful on a track. But again, I think back to heart rate and pace.
Awesome. So that's run. Now let's talk about bike-specific metrics. So power is a good one. We've got average power, and then we also have normalized power. Do you want to tell us what normalized power is?
Sure. So average power is the power for the entire ride, including when you're coasting, i.e. zeros. And then normalized power is all your power except for the zeros. So we typically tend to look at normalized power as a better indicator of load because you could be coasting a lot or a little, it doesn't matter. So that's useful. Heart rate, again, back to heart rate, that's super useful. Cadence is useful. Katie, other variables that we should be using in bike?
Yeah, I think those are the three. I would say speed is not that useful. You want to be moving quickly, but it's very terrain dependent. So when I ride out in California, for example, a strong ride that's going to have a really high average power and normalized power for me is usually going to be like in the 14 miles per hour range, just because it's so hilly out there. Whereas if I'm in a pancake flat area, I bike a lot down near Boston, I can be cruising well above 20 miles an hour at the same power. So I'd say speed is not that useful. I mean, you can think about it a little bit in a race for your overall time, but focus on that average power, normalized power, heart rate, and then cadence. We talk about cadence being a little bit different depending on the race that you're doing, but Ironman cadence is usually like 70 to 80, and then you might see more 85 to 90 with half Ironman, or 80 to 90, and then even like 95 could be common for sprint and Olympic as well.
And we also use total time and total distance, especially for our longer distance athletes. It's obviously important to make 100 miles feel, pretty easy, or do it on a regular basis. Or total time, sometimes we'll say to people like, go out for a 6-hour ride because we think that's in the ballpark of what you're going to finish your Ironman in. So we do use that as well.
Yeah. And I would say also we have a lot of athletes who ask, like, is it worth it to get a power meter for their bike? I think that it is on net. That would be my recommendation. But I have also trained athletes that just use heart rate data on the bike. And especially for an Ironman, your biggest focus needs to be not going over your lactate threshold. So if you want to go into the Ironman and say, yeah, I'm just going to see where my pace lands or my speed lands at just under that ceiling, then that's also okay with us. We can absolutely make it work. I think power can just help you kind of execute workouts outside and have sort of an idea of, where you're moving relative to your training, but it is not so essential that you can't do an Ironman if you don't have one.
Yeah, I'm a big advocate for training with power. I always tell people it's like an open book test. It's just the answer is sitting right there. So if you're trying to hit an ideal 72% of your FTP is kind of an ideal for Ironman. And so, if you do a power meter, you're going to sit there for your 112 miles and basically stare at your power meter, make sure you're in that zone, and then just focus on eating and drinking essentially.
Mm-hmm. I agree with that. Although I would say sometimes if you get a race where it's really hot, that power is not going to work out for you. So like in Ironman St. George, we were not doing 72% of our FTP. We definitely could do that at Ironman Lake Placid, but at St. George, it was probably like 65% or something, really, really low relative to our training. So just keep that in mind. We talk with our athletes about this right before their races anyway.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely.
Swim time.
Yeah, our favorite topic. This is the topic we're going to avoid an episode on. So we're just going to talk about it in piecemeal in every episode.
Exactly.
Right? So swim metrics. What do we use?
Honestly, I would say the most important swim metric is visual data. So sending us videos or us standing on the pool deck evaluating your form. So we talked about how we're not really going to use heart rate when we're swimming. Pace can be useful to us. You're executing workouts on these specific intervals, which is useful. But at the end of the day, as a triathlete, the biggest thing you need to do is have really, really good swim form. So swimming is smooth and easy and doesn't take anything out of you for the run and the bike. So, if we have athletes who are like, I'd rather not wear my watch in the pool, that's actually okay with me. I don't mind that so much because I care the most about them executing the planned workout, using the pace clock on the wall, and then just some visual data.
Right. We always say you don't need to necessarily swim fast as a triathlete. You just need to swim well. And that pace is going to be that pace. You need to be able to swim, a relaxed swim, whether that's a sprint or an Olympic or half Ironman.
Totally. All right, so we made it through swim, bike, run. One other thing we could think about is sleep data. So as we said before, a lot of us wear, Oura Ring or Whoop or Garmin, and in general, that can give us some data on how well we are sleeping. In my experience, so I recently got an Oura Ring, and that's previewing my gear pick of the week, which is the Oura Ring. But I find that it's a little bit better than Garmin for sleep accuracy. And I think the same is generally true for Whoop because these devices are optimized specifically for sleep. Oura is a pretty terrible activity tracker, so that's why I wear both. But in general, Garmin I can sort of trick by just lying very still. And then it's like, you got 8 hours of sleep. And I'm like, actually, I was lying awake still for 2 of those hours. And I cannot really fool Oura in that way. But I think in general, it's really good to know if maybe your sleep quality is not so great because that could be contributing to why you're feeling tired. So if you get 8 hours, but it's all really, really light sleep, then maybe you're not actually restoring in the way that you need to. And again, heart rate and HRV are both kind of measured during sleep and you see what they are in the morning. So I think all of that is fairly useful. But the broader point is, it's way more important to just sleep well than to have data showing that you're sleeping well. So if you want to just do it holistically and not wear your watch, we're totally okay with that too.
And do you find your Oura Ring it seems pretty low profile. Is it fairly comfortable?
Yeah, it's not too bad. I would say the one thing about the Oura Ring is that it can sometimes, like if your hand gets wet, if you wash your hands or you're swimming, it's really easy for water to get a little bit trapped under it. And then it can sometimes give you a little bit of chafing. Like I've experienced that with a Garmin too, but a Garmin's a lot easier to take off, whereas the Oura Ring's a little bit tighter. But other than that, I mean, people are like, oh, that's a nice fashionable ring. And I've gotten a lot of compliments on it, which is cool. That's really what I'm in the business of activity tracking for is the compliments.
Right. It's the bling.
Yeah, the bling. Totally. But yeah, no, big fan so far. And yeah, that is my gear pick of the week. So jumping right ahead. Okay, so with all that in mind, I think we're ready to just cover some really big take-home points in thinking about data. I think the first one is that Garmin does not capture just your perceptions of your overall feeling, and it's really important to just trust your body. So if you wake up and you're like, Garmin says that I am prime and that I slept great and my HRV is doing awesome and my resting heart rate is great, you might still feel a little bit off, and you shouldn't just say, okay, that's not real. I think the most important thing is how you perceive yourself to be feeling. And I would also say that part of that is because these devices are pretty good at measuring physical and physiological metrics, but not really at mental or emotional ones. And we know that life stress is so real. And sure, sometimes it can be captured with HRV or resting heart rate or sleep, but not always. So just trust your body. And again, we talked about this last week in a challenge of trying to be okay with getting some yellow boxes or orange boxes. That's a great reflection of just really thinking about how you feel and being in tune with yourself.
Yeah, and also too, I think we talk about these injuries and niggles, and they're not always captured as well, right? So, like you said before, you could be injured, but your Garmin's saying go for it, and you're like, no, you should not be going for it.
Yeah. Especially if you get injured, I would say just turn all the tracking stuff off, because within like 3 days, if you're taking time off, your watch is going to say that you are prime for heavy training because you're not moving as much. And that's honestly the worst thing you can do. So ditch the watch, ditch Strava, take a break, focus on other stuff, because in my experience, it can just make you feel a whole lot worse mentally, which being injured, that just sucks to begin with. Then to recap a little bit what we were saying before, I think the most useful data for us as coaches is to be looking at heart rate, power, pace, and sleep, but you need to use them together and holistically rather than individually. And always remember the intention of that workout. That can give you a little bit more of an idea on what is going to be most useful in terms of data. So if it's a zone 2 run for 4 miles or 5 miles, just think about being in zone 2 heart rate for maybe 40 to 45 minutes. That's what we want to be focusing on rather than all these other stats like pace or things. If we have a pace workout on the track, that's where we might focus on pace.
Yeah, and I think it's also just, it's useful just to go data free every once in a while, especially during the off season, or to reduce personal reliance on the data. And I just think that data gets in the way of play a lot of times. And we always say, keep the recreation and recreational athlete. Your sport should be fun. It should have any pressure. You think about it like playing like a child. They're uninhibited. They have no fear of other people's opinions, this faux pas, and sort of be present. So yeah, sometimes just get rid of the data.
Yeah, I did that recently, actually. I took a bit of a break from recording much of anything, and I took some runs with a completely bare wrist. And it was awesome. I have preached this a few times on this podcast, but then I was like, oh, I haven't actually really done this. And so I did it a few times. And it was so freeing to get back from those runs and be like, I don't really know what my pace was. I don't really know what my heart rate was, but that was really beautiful. Like that was super fun. And I had a great time. And then I decided to ease back into it. One of the times I was like, okay, well, I'm not going to record it on my watch, but I'll just get the Strava app going on my phone. So I'm not looking at it, but then I'll have the record after. And I finished the run and I looked down and realized I hadn't pressed start on the app. And I was like, this was meant to be. This is really good. And, I survived. I still could run. I still can train. My life has gone on. And I really cannot emphasize enough how awesome it is to do that. And you can even do that while working with a coach. Like it's okay to say, hey, I did my run, but I'm doing it data free. We believe you. You know what zone 2 is. Don't do that all the time. And if you can't be honest to zone 2, then obviously it's helpful to have that heart rate. But yeah, the upshot here is data is good, but also going data free is really awesome.
Yeah, I mean, it's a real courageous act. And I tell you, I don't know if I can do that, but I want to try. Maybe that'll be my challenge of the week at some point.
Yeah, I would recommend it. It changed things for me in a big way. So
yeah. And I think the last point here that I'm reading a little bit about is that sort of instead of data driving your practice or your performance, you can try imagery. So for example, you could watch videos of good swimmers and runners and cyclists. And then this provides this implicit visual learning opportunity to imprint on how to best perform in their sport. And sort of an exercise you can do, it's sort of without data. Like you say, you can even just without wearing your watch. But something you can try is that you can pretend you're playing the role in a movie of one of these professional athletes while doing your sport and then mimic their movements. And what you'll probably find is that you'll move smoothly and with less effort and more flow. So there's really this unconscious visual learning is super powerful. So it doesn't always have to be data driven or, as you say, no data at all.
I love that. Yeah. Just channel your inner Katie Ledecky while you're in the pool. I can do that. We have the same name. So we're basically the same. Last point we're going to say is the very best data that you can produce is really good communication with your coach. So that can come in the form of TrainingPeaks comments. It can be a text. It can be hopping on a call, whatever that is. That is the best way for us to figure out what's going on. And I find that awesome. Even just kind of the tone of my athletes, how they're thinking about their training, how they're talking about how they feel, that can tell me a lot about a window into how they're doing. And of course, it's best if they're really upfront about it. But in general, I think that data is something we maybe don't always think the most about because you can't quantify it in numbers. But again, that open dialogue is the best way for us to do person-first coaching. So never hesitate to loop us in about the highs, the lows, and everything in between, because we'll then be able to make changes that best support you as an athlete.
I love as coaches too, the skill of being able to just to interpret like a small phrase from somebody and say, oh, wait, this may be, one very short sentence, but it really tells a bigger narrative. And sort of interpreting that and understanding what that means for that individual is super important. And it's a good skill to have as a coach.
Yeah, it's pretty cool to be a coach. All right. Well, I think we're on to our last couple of segments. We'll do 2 rapid fire challenge of the weeks. Jim, you previewed that you were going to maybe do a challenge of the week and going data free for a session, but you can have a second one if you want to.
Okay. So mine is that daily drink 1 more glass or 1 more water bottle than you normally would. The benefits of hydration are numerous, and as endurance athletes, we're probably all a little, or in my case, a lot dehydrated. So I'm going to start trying to drink some more.
Yeah, I like that. Drink water, to be clear. We're not pushing the other side of drinking here on this podcast. On that vein, I am going to give a challenge. I think it's great to think about taking in a combo of protein and carbs within 5 minutes of finishing your workout. I'm a huge fan of the protein shake in the shower. You can just roll that right in there and you're ready to go. And I think a lot of times people will wait even just 15 or 20 minutes and already your muscles are starting to break down and screaming for something. So just take the time to put a shake in your pool bag or in your car or wherever it is so that as soon as you're done, you can take something in, kickstart your recovery, and then not be rushed through, getting your shower, getting changed, moving on to the next thing.
And this week, did we have any listener questions?
Yes, we did. Okay, looks like we have 3 questions here. The first one that we got is, how can we make the TT position more comfortable? So this question came from one of my athletes who did get a bike fit. And again, the very first move is to get a bike fit. But I find that even after a bike fit, some people find it a really big adjustment to be getting on the TT bike. So I think in general, you do want to be sitting sort of on your sit bones, but towards the front of the saddle. You might need to switch out different saddle types. This is especially true for female athletes because a lot of saddles are designed for men, but also think about having really comfortable bike shorts and chamois cream. And I find that the combination of shorts and saddle is actually crucial. So I wear a different combination of shorts and saddle for my TT bike versus my road bike versus my gravel bike to maximize comfort. I like a little bit of a thinner chamois on my TT bike, which is more similar to a tri-kit, and something a little bit thicker on the road bike. So figure out, you might have to do a little bit of trial and error on that, but it's okay to return things. If you buy something and it doesn't work for you, then think about figuring out what really works because you're going to spend a lot of time on this bike. One other thing I would say is we don't think you have to be an aero for 100% of your rides all of the time. I think a lot of people think that. But what I'll often do is stay in aero for specific intervals, but not for the whole ride. So for example, I might do like the warm up, the 15-minute warm up, and then the primer set out of aero. And then let's say I have 3 by 10 minute half Ironman intervals. Maybe I'll go down into aero for those 3 by 10 minutes, come out in between, and then stay out for the cool down. You're still going to be building great fitness. And if you're the type of person who is more comfortable to be in aero, then by all means do it. But in a lot of races, you will be kind of up and down anyway because you're going to be snacking or maybe you're climbing a hill. And we don't think that you have to be there the entire time unless it feels really, really comfortable to do that. On that vein, a general reminder that if you're riding outdoors, we only recommend being in aero if you're going faster than about 15 miles per hour. And then if you're getting well over 30 miles per hour, that can be a little shaky and a little dangerous. So usually in that 15 to 30 range is where I'm staying in aero.
Right. If you're coming down the Keen Descent, if you're doing Ironman Lake Placid, it's okay to get out of aero. Yeah. And we encourage you to be out of aero.
Oh, yes. That's previewing our Ironman Lake Placid episode that a lot of listeners are excited about.
Exactly. I think the other thing I would mention here is that you can periodize your TT position. So for example, if you're more than 12 weeks out from your A race, then you can do a lot less time in aero. So it's just think about what time of the year that you're at. So I have some athletes recently who were saying, I'm trying to be in aero all the time. And it's like, okay, but your race is 24 weeks from now, so they don't need to be in aero.
Definitely. Next question. Treadmill paces are always off compared to Garmin. What metrics should we use? So I would say that for this, if you're doing zone 2 on the treadmill, I usually go for time in zone 2 rather than pace, just because every treadmill is calibrated totally differently. And I just find that based on my cadence on the treadmill, I can convince my watch that I'm going a full minute faster or slower. So it's not really super accurate. But if, for example, a 5-mile run usually takes you 45 minutes outside, I would just do like 45 minutes of zone 2 heart rate on the treadmill. And then similarly, you can adjust the treadmill to kind of perceived effort and heart rate for pickups and other things that you're adding onto your runs like that. I would not try to simulate things like max hill sprints on the treadmill. There's just not really a steep enough analog, and it would be a little bit dangerous to do that. And we would say we don't really recommend trying to simulate track workouts on the treadmill unless you really, really have to based on where you're training, or you know that your treadmill's pace is accurate, just because it can be really hard to get that good calibration. And when you can, we love for our athletes to get outside. Hopefully that's getting a little bit easier as the weather gets warmer.
And also as best practice too as well with the treadmill, set your treadmill at either 1% or 2% as a normal. So don't typically run at a flat grade on your treadmill, and get a fan, and also get a huge TV.
Make it more bearable for yourself. All right, last question. Jim, should I buy a road helmet or a TT helmet for riding my bike?
Right. So yeah, we get this a lot now. So I'd say that we really prefer road helmets over those big, clunky, sort of hot TT helmets for training and for racing. And there's just a few reasons why. Is that, most of the races are really hot, and thermal regulation is often more important than saving a few seconds on course. Road helmets are more comfortable. And now also a lot of road helmets are nearly just as aero as a lot of the quote aero helmets. So I'd say go to your local bike shop, try on a bunch of different helmets, but I would aim more towards, more ventilation, more road helmet, something you can just use all the time as opposed to getting a very specific TT helmet. Unless, of course, bike racing is your primary sport and you're trying to take off seconds off the local 20K, then sure, you might want to have a very specific helmet. But otherwise, for most of our athletes, go with a nice, comfortable aero type road helmet.
Yeah, I would say there's so many other things that you can do to be aero, like a more aero bike fit, or even a more aero kit can be a thing that you focus on, but the helmet is going to be on that order of like 0.01% improvement. So I wouldn't worry about it too much either. All right, we made it to the end, and I think I get to blaze past my gear pick of the week because I already talked about it, but I will recommend the Oura Ring. So I got one, I think, in December, and it's been awesome to just have a little bit more accurate data for me on things like sleep, resting heart rate, HRV. I've been selling it to a lot of people. I've gotten so many questions from friends about this, or often people that compliment my ring. And then I'm like, okay, this is a fitness tracker, not a beauty piece, but I'm glad that you like it. And to speak to that, it is pretty subtle. So I think a lot of people might not want to wear like a Whoop in addition to a Garmin, but I do find that either of those are a lot more accurate. And then something else that the Oura Ring has that the Garmin doesn't is some really cool body temperature stats. So that's really interesting because that's another indicator that can be a precursor to getting sick. So your body temperature will go up a lot if you're sick, as well as for female athletes, there's some really interesting cycle tracking metrics that come off of body temperature. So in general, really highly recommend that Oura Ring. Again, if you could only have an Oura Ring or a Garmin as a triathlete, I would pick the Garmin because Oura is a terrible activity tracker. And all the time it'll be like, are you doing housework? And I'm like, I just walked around my house, but thank you for the active calorie burn. But I do think that it's a really useful tool for some of these other metrics. So highly recommend.
Nice. Well, this week I'm going a little bit different. It's not gear. It's actually a book. And it sort of relates to what I talked about in one of my coaching insights, which is treating the body and mind as one unit. So my recommendation for gear pick of the week is that it's a book. It's called The Mindful Athlete: Secrets to Pure Performance by George Mumford. It's super engaging. George is a really interesting guy. He's the guy who worked with Michael Jordan and Kobe Bryant and just all other kinds of professional athletes. So super good book. Check it out.
Sweet. Awesome. Well, this has been a good episode. I hope it wasn't too dry because we talked about a lot of data, but hopefully some of you will have the courage to either go data free or turn off your training readiness or do all these other things that ground in the things that actually matter. And at the end of the day, your most valuable data is just talking to us. So fill out our feedback form, answer your TrainingPeaks comments, reach out in any way. We always love to hear from our athletes and our listeners.
Thanks, peeps.